Okay, muscle-wise, don't attempt all 600 plus muscles, probably only about 30 that we'll have to commit to memory, but I'll show you those as we go through. It's important to understand how they contract, and I think this is a real short video on muscle contraction.
Hey everyone, this is Nicole from FinHub, and in this tutorial we'll be discussing how the names of muscles are derived. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about how the names of muscles are derived, as studying anatomy can be quite challenging, from remembering the names of muscles to knowing their insertion, origin, innervation and function. And it's sometimes difficult just to remember the name of a muscle, let alone all the other structures that are associated with it. So in this tutorial we're going to discuss how muscles get their names, in order to help make it easier for you to identify muscles and to remember them. And there are quite a few basic conventions when it comes to the naming of a muscle, and once you understand these basic conventions, it becomes much easier to identify them. So in the following slides, we're going to have a look at some basic methods used to name or derive the name of a muscle, which usually take into account one or more characteristics of the muscle, and these characteristics include shape, size, orientation of fibers, action, number of origins, origin and insertion, function, and location. And we'll talk a little bit about each of these as we go along. So let's have a look at the first way we can derive a name for a muscle, and that's from the muscle's shape. And if we look at our image over here on the right, of course we have an image of the deltoid in green here, shaped like a triangle. And since the muscle has a fairly well-defined shape, we can assume the triangle might have some significance in the naming, and sure enough, the Greek letter delta, when written, is shaped like a triangle, and therefore gives rise to the name deltoid. And so the name for the deltoid muscle arises from its shape. Let's also have a quick look at the trapezius muscle, which we can see has a diamond shape, and of course you can see that the name of the trapezius is derived from the word trapezoid, which refers to the muscle's four-sided shape. The quality of a muscle, with its regard to its dimension, can also be used to derive the name of a muscle. And in this case, we're looking at a muscle whose main attribute is its flatness. The French word plate means flat, and so from that we get the word platysma for the platysma muscle that covers the superficial aspect of the muscles of the neck. In the case of the serratus anterior muscle, as you can see, the anterior attachments of the muscle are shaped like the fingers of a saw, or like the Latin word serrare, which conveniently means saw, hence giving the name serratus anterior. In many cases, muscles also derive their names from the size of a muscle, and some of these terms that we use to denote the size of a muscle include vastus, which comes from the Latin meaning great, for example the vastus lateralis muscle, and as you can see on the image on the right, the vastus lateralis muscle is a large muscle that travels all the way down the length of the femur, hence the name great. The term major is also used to describe how large a muscle is, usually in comparison to another muscle, for example the pectoralis major muscle. And in contrast, the term minor, as you may have guessed, is used to describe a muscle that is the smaller of two similar muscles, as is the case with the pectoralis minor muscle. And the term Maximus comes from the Latin meaning largest or greatest. And as we can see on the right here, the Gluteus Maximus muscle is the largest muscle in the pelvic region, hence the use of the word Maximus. The term minimus is the Latin for least or smallest, and is also used in naming muscles such as the gluteus minimus muscle, which is the smallest of the three gluteal muscles, or in the case of the hand, the flexor digiti minimi muscle, which flexes the little finger. The length of a muscle can also be taken into account. For example, the word longus is used for long muscles, such as the longus capitis muscle, a long muscle of the head and neck. The word brevis, which is the Latin word for short, is used to describe short muscles, such as the abductor pollicis brevis muscle, which is a short muscle of the thumb. The muscles can also derive their names from the orientation of their muscle fibers. The terms used to describe the orientation of muscle fibers include transverse, oblique, and rectus. The term transverse, which is used in the naming of the transverse muscle of the tongue, is used to describe muscle fibers that run perpendicular to the midline. The term oblique is used to describe muscle fibers that run diagonally at an angle or slanting. A good example of this would be the oblique muscles of the abdomen. And here we can see the external oblique muscle, whose fibers, as you can see, run obliquely. And finally, the term rectus describes muscle fibers that run parallel to the midline, such as in the case of the rectus abdominis muscle, which is seen here. And the word rectus in Latin means straight, and can also be used to describe a muscle that runs straight. For example, the superior rectus muscle, which is one of the 4 rectus muscles that control the movement of the eye. The fourth quality that is taken into consideration when naming muscles is the action that the muscle facilitates. As such, muscles can be described as flexors, extensors, supinators, pronators, levators, depressors, rotators, adductors, abductors, sphincters, and tensor muscles. These actions are usually the inverse of each other, and we'll point these out as we go along. But it'll definitely help to think about these actions mostly in terms of pairs, as one counterbalancing the other. The so-called flexor muscles carry out flexion, which is the action of decreasing the angle between 2 points. And a good example of these muscles are the flexor muscles of the forearm. For example, the flexor carpi radialis, which is one of the superficial flexors of the forearm, and is responsible for flexing the hand at the wrist joint or radial abduction. Next, extension describes the opposite action of flexion, and the extensor muscles are muscles that return the limb to its original position or straighten the limb. For example, the extensor indicis muscle straightens the index finger. Supination describes the action of turning the limb so that the palm of the hand or the sole of the foot faces upward or outward. For example, when the supinating muscle of the forearm contracts, it rotates the forearm and hand so that the palm faces upwards. Pronation, on the other hand, describes the rotation of the limb so that the palm of the hand or the sole of the foot face downward and inward. For example, the aptly named pronator teres muscles carries out this very action. The term levator is used to describe muscles that perform a lifting action. For example, the levator anguli oris muscle lifts or elevates the angle of the mouth when we smile. The term depressor is used to describe a muscle that carries out the opposite action of levator muscles, which is depression or pulling downward. For example, when we make a sad face, the depressor anguli oris muscle is responsible for pulling the angles of the mouth downward. Rotators, as the name suggests, are muscles that facilitate the rotation of a limb or circular motion about a joint. For example, the muscles of the rotator cuff, which although individually do not have the word rotator in their names, are called the rotator cuff muscles simply because this is the action that they collectively carry out. An example of one of these muscles of the rotator cuff is the supraspinatus muscle, highlighted here in green, and the supraspinatus facilitates internal and external rotation of the humerus. Abductor muscles facilitate abduction, which is the movement of the limb or appendage away from the midline. The abductor pollicis brevis muscle, for example, abducts the thumb or facilitates the movement of the thumb away from the midline. Adductor muscles, on the other hand, facilitate movement towards the midline, as is the case with the adductor pollicis muscles, which adduct the thumb, as you can see in this image. The term sphincter is used for muscles that close an opening, for example, the pyloric sphincter muscle. Finally, tensors describe muscles that tighten or make something rigid, like the tensor fascia lata muscle, which sustains tension of the iliotibial tract. So now we're going to have a little bit of a look at some muscles which derive their names from the number of points of attachment at their site of origin. And a good example of these muscles are the biceps brachii muscle, which has 2 points of origin, the triceps brachii muscle, which has 3 points of origin, and the quadriceps femoris muscle, which has 4 points of origin. And I'm sure you can see a pattern forming here. The term bicep comes from the Latin meaning two-headed, the bi meaning two, and the se coming from the word caput, which means head. Following the same logic, the three-headed muscle is aptly given the prefix tri, and the four-headed muscle quadri. In addition to being able to be named after the number of points or origin of a muscle, muscles can also be named according to their point of origin and insertion. And one such example is the sternohyoid muscle, which is a muscle of the neck region that has its origins on the dorsal surface of the manubrium of the sternum and the sternoclavicular joint, and inserts on the body of the hyoid bone. And of course, there are also some muscles that have been named according to their function. For example, the Latin word risus means laugh, and therefore the muscle of facial expression that is used when a person is laughing is called the risorius muscle. And this muscle is sometimes simply referred to as the laughing muscle. Finally, some muscles are named according to their location in the body. For example, the tibialis anterior muscle is located in front of the tibia. Some muscles also derive their names after their position or location in reference to a similar muscle, and in that case, the following terms would be used. Infra-inferior, meaning below or more caudally situated. Supra or superior, meaning above or more cranially situated. Medialis, medial, middle or medius, meaning in the middle or closer to the midline. Intermedius, meaning intermediate. And lateralis or lateral, meaning to the side or away from the midline. An example of a muscle named using one of these basic terminologies would be a muscle we've looked at briefly before, the supraspinatus muscle, which is the more superiorly situated of the two spinatus muscles of the scapula. This video is more fun than reading a textbook.
So if you can sort of write those notes, good man, you're really good. Anyway, we'll get back. We have Goldie over here, our Sindabber. So once we start working with her, I'll give you a set of notes to go along with that, okay, on what you're responsible for. Because there's so much information, but that just gives you a really quick overview, but a real quick overview of that. And then your anatomy, this is just a picture from the anatomy physiology book, right? And you will get this suffering through Anatomy Physiology 1, where you will have to memorize all those muscles, but we won't do that. We don't really have a function in this class to do it. Maybe anatomy. Anybody taking Anatomy Physiology? Who knows if they're going to make you memorize the muscles? It's healthy, but it's unhealthy because you won't remember it when you need it. So, but anyway, so there's a lot of muscles. I had memorized all of them in Anatomy Physiology 1, and I memorized most of them long enough to pass my test, and then boom, they, just like algebra, it goes away. There's the bag. Okay, on to something a little bit more digestible. Is the circulation, movement of blood flow through the vessels. You guys just finished your Khan Academy, right? And so the circulatory system, the heart, obviously the pump, right? So you have the heart, and its primary goal is to pump. There's functions of it, right? But it's to pump the blood through the circulatory system, through the veins and arteries. Okay, it's a pump. The heart is a 4-chambered, 4-valve pump. So if you know anything about pumps, then you look at that and you go, okay, I have a right side pump and a left side pump because we have a right side heart and a left side heart, and then the 4 valves that it goes through. Also, the blood or the fluid, all right? The blood is primarily responsible for transport oxygen and remove waste products from the cells, right? It transports oxygen on what? Anybody know what it transports oxygen on? How's oxygen transported? What on the red blood cell? Hemoglobin, right. It's transported on the hemoglobin. The way that the hemoglobin is actually shaped, and the red blood cell is shaped, and the hemoglobin is shaped, okay? The red blood cell primarily is the only thing that's going to fit on there because of the shape. And then it removes waste products. What are these waste products that they're talking about? Carbon dioxide. Now there's other functions of the blood, right? Like the liquid part of the blood is considered what? What's the liquid part of the blood considered? The plasma, right? Then we have white blood cells. White blood cells are responsible for fighting off infection. There's several different sort of types, okay? plasma, then platelets. What are platelets responsible for?
Coagulation.
Right, coagulation or clotting. And then we go to the vessels. You watched your Khan Academy video on the blood vessels or the pipes that it flows through. Okay, these vessels constrict and dilate according to the needs of the body, and then the brain works in conjunction with the heart to create blood flow where it's needed the most. Right? If we're running down the hall, our legs require more blood flow, correct? So the body's going to, it's called auto-regulation. It's going to auto-regulate, and it's going to send more blood down to the legs because that's where the need is. Right? Supply and demand. So you have these different things here, okay, as we work through them. And like I said, this is just a very quick overview, okay? We'll get back to these things like the layers of the blood vessel. What are the 3 layers of the blood vessel? They all begin with tunica. Right, very good. So you would get that correct on your Khan Academy test. Okay. So you have the vessel, and you have different parts of the vessel, and all these blood vessels have nerves that are in contact with them, so they can dilate and they can constrict in response to the needs of the body. Okay. If our blood pressure drops for some reason, one of the most common ways is, have you ever been sitting and you get up real fast and you get dizzy? What happens to your blood pressure? Yeah, it drops. It's called orthostatic hypotension, and what takes place is your vessels dilate, or your blood pressure drops, and because your vessels dilate, and that's why you get dizzy. Right? It's self-regulating. You sit back down, and all that goes back to normal. Correct? Okay. So when that takes place, what the body does is it constricts those vessels to return you back to a normal state, or return you back to homeostasis. Right? Okay. There's a gazillion blood vessels. In Anatomy and Physiology 2, you will memorize all the blood vessels in the body. And fortunately, most of them correspond with a bone. So it makes it a little bit easier to remember. You've already learned the bones. So now you take that information and you correspond this with the blood vessels. Radial, radius, right? Femoral, femur. Dorsal would be the top, pedis. Dorsal pedis or dorsal pedal pulse on top of the foot or on the back of the foot would be the top. Okay. Brachial. Some of them don't really go with the bones, and then you just have to sort of commit the carotid, the pulse that we check, the carotid artery pulse that we check on an unconscious person. Okay. So there's a lot of them, and most of them correspond with the bone. Temporal, the temporal bone right here, you have a pulse point right here in your head as well, okay? So we'll later memorize the pulse points. Right now, not so much. In definition, when we look at this, arteries carry blood away from the heart, right? You have to remember that in the pulmonary system, right? Because you have the pulmonary artery that has deoxygenated blood in it, but it still fits the definition because it's carrying blood away from the heart. Okay? Veins typically carry blood towards the heart. So arteries away, veins towards. As they break down smaller and smaller, you get the arterioles and then the venules. Okay, just the really small veins. And just a good big picture here. Once we get to see Goldie, then this will, you'll see where this femoral artery goes through. This is sort of a busy picture, right? It shows you some of the muscles in here as well. Rectus femoris, that big muscle that they talked about in the video, right? And then capillaries. So if you're going through the arterial system, you go arteries, arterioles, capillary, right? Capillary bed, and then you go venules, and then veins. And then on the artery side, it branches off the aorta, and then on the venous side, it's the inferior and superior vena cava. Right? But it puts in this capillary, and this capillary bed. At the capillary bed, get this picture in your mind about a capillary bed, okay? Especially in the lungs, is these capillaries, they're microscopic, and there's like a gazillion of them, and they just sort of lay over the tissue. And they're so thin that it allows diffusion to take place in those because they're super, super thin. Picture like the alveolus, right? The air sacs. Capillaries lay over it. There's a pulmonary capillary bed, so it lays over that, okay? And what happens is those, it looks like, you know, the alveolus, those air sacs, I picture those as grapes. You know how you get a bunch of grapes off of the stem, okay? But now picture those grapes with spider webs all over them. And that would be like a capillary bed. If you could see that, that's what you would see essentially, is these air sacs, and you have a gazillion of them, okay? So you have all these air sacs, but you have all these capillaries laying over them like a spider web. Just completely cover them up. And that's how we get diffusion. Now, sadly, diffusion, right, from biology. We'll talk about it. Good. Oops, didn't want to do that.
Blood is responsible for transporting oxygen to the cells and removing carbon dioxide for excretion by the lungs. Blood carries nutrients, ions, water, hormones, and enzymes to all body cells and carries away the waste products. Blood regulates the pH and temperature of the body. Blood is composed of the liquid portion, plasma, and solids called formed elements. Plasma makes up 55% of the total blood volume, 91% which is water. Plasma proteins are albumin to maintain osmotic pressure and water balance, globulin antibodies to help the immune system, and fibrinogen, an essential component for blood clotting. The formed elements are erythrocytes or red blood cells, leukocytes or white blood cells, and thrombocytes or platelets. Red blood cells have no nucleus, therefore they do not divide and only live 120 days. Red blood cells contain hemoglobin that carries oxygen to all cells of the body and then carries away carbon dioxide. There are 5 types of white blood cells, 3 granular and 2 non-granular. Under the microscope, the granular types appear to have grains. They are neutrophils, eosinophils, basophils. Neutrophils phagocytize or eat up foreign substance and secrete lysosomes that destroy bacteria. Eosinophils produce antihistamines that combat irritants. Basophils are also involved in allergic reactions, secreting heparin, histamines, and serotonin. Monocytes also phagocytize bacteria and dead cells, and when they enter the tissue, they are called macrophages. Lymphocytes produce antibodies and are crucial to the body's immune system. Bacteria are being destroyed by neutrophils, lymphocytes, and macrophages. Platelets initiate the chain reaction and clot formation.
All right. Not all that. As we get into it, we'll talk about those different types of cells. Again, I just wanted you to get sort of this overview. I mean, we will talk about histamines, right? And we'll talk a lot about the red blood cell and hemoglobin and platelets. See, everything has two names, right? But we're going to pick the easier name for the cells. Okay? It's just easier to, it's the same thing and it's easier to memorize. Okay? So, red blood cell gives color to it, iron, carries oxygen, carries carbon dioxide away. Now, here's something that we're going to learn. Keep in mind for right now that hemoglobin carries oxygen to the cells and carries carbon dioxide away from the cells. But shortly, we're going to learn that not too much carbon dioxide is actually attached to the hemoglobin. There's only very little. I think it's, don't quote me on the percentage, but I think it's only 7%. What happens with the carbon dioxide is it breaks down in carbonic acid and it's transported in the plasma and then it reforms back in the lungs. We'll look at that later. That's for a later day. But in the future, remember that really only about 7% is transported here. Most of the carbon dioxide is transported in the plasma. White blood cells fights infections, produce antibodies, right? Someone with an infection, a lot of times their white blood cell count is up. That's how they know. They draw a WBC, white blood cell count, and they look at that and they say, whoa, you've got 12,000 white blood cells. And they diagnose them with some sort of infection. Hopefully this will work because this is pretty cool. This is the white blood cell here, and I think it's on it's bacteria. See, chasing it. Boom. Got it. Yay, we win. And like we talked about, the plasma part, most of it's water, but it's the liquid part of the blood, and the platelets responsible for blood clotting. And as we go through this more and more, we'll talk about these areas, like what the function of platelets when we talk about blood actually clotting in a few weeks. But for now, just know the components of it. All right. Questions? Anything? Everybody good?